The 1970s was an incredibly influential period of time for politics. The decade was rocked with executive scandals, foreign policy issues, and economic recession. Aside from these issues, however, the decade also brought huge changes in social issues, such as abortion and the death penalty. These Supreme Court cases would become landmark cases in years to come, and we would be remembered for
I was like, this is just about to happen.
one of the largest and most well-known scandals of the Nixon administration was the Watergate scandal. Nixon was caught spying on the Democratic National Convention at the Watergate Hotel in an effort to gain a competitive edge over his opponents.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
Nixon promptly resigned before he could be impeached, ushering in Gerald Ford as the new president. The scandal shook the nation, so much so that it remains one of the most well-known scandals to this day. It greatly reduced the public acceptance of Nixon as well as his credibility for years to come. One of the largest scandals of the Ford administration was his pardoning of Nixon. Nixon, who would quickly become a despised public figure, was expected to go to court for his actions. Ford's pardoning of Nixon was highly controversial and was a very unpopular move with the public. During Richard Nixon's presidency, he launched initiatives to fight cancer and illegal drugs, imposed wage and price controls, enforced desegregation of southern schools, and introduced legislation to reform healthcare and welfare. Nixon was the commander-in-chief during many of the moon landings, including Apollo 11, which was the first manned mission to the moon. He also established the Environmental Protection Agency and Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and signed into law the Clean Air Act and National Environmental Policy Act. One of the major foreign policy issues of the Nixon administration was the Vietnam War. Nixon initially escalated the war, but eventually signed the Paris Peace Accords, thus ending the conflict in Vietnam. During his presidency, Gerald Ford faced the worst economy since the Great Depression, and faced growing inflation rates and an economic recession. Ford also established the Special Education Program. President Carter's administration dealt mainly with environmental issues and education issues. Carter established the Department of Energy and the Department of Education, two departments which are still around to this day. The Carter administration saw gas prices skyrocket, an issue which garnered the attention of the nation. In terms of foreign policy, Carter presided over the Iranian hostage crisis. President Carter also presided over the Camp David Accords, which was a peace treaty signed by Egypt and Israel. This came at a time of continuous conflict between the two nations and created lasting peace among the two parties.
The Supreme Court at the beginning of 1970 consisted of Chief Justice Warren Burger, John Harlan Marshall, Harry A. Blackmun, Thurgood Marshall, Potter Stewart, William Orville Douglas, Byron White, William J. Brennan Jr., and Hugo Black. By 1979, William Douglas, John Harlan Marshall, and Hugo Black will be replaced with Lewis Powell Jr., William Rehnquist, and John Steffens. Although Chief Justice Warren Burger was nominated by Nixon, whose aims were conservative, the position of the 1970s Burger Court was liberal to moderate, as were most of its major decisions. The Burger Court is often seen as a transition period between the liberal Warren Court before it and the conservative court that would follow it. For example, in 1972, Furman v. Georgia, the court put a moratorium on the death penalty. But in 1976, Gregg v. Georgia, the court declared the death penalty constitutional. The addition of conservative William Rehnquist in 1972, moderate conservative John Steffens in 1975, and swing voter Lewis Powell brought more conservative votes to the court, but wasn't enough to outweigh the opinions of staunch liberals such as Hugo Black, William Brennan Jr., Thurgood Marshall, Harry A. Blackmun, and moderate liberal Warren Burger. This caused most of the decisions in the 1970s to be liberal.
Cleveland Board of Education v. LaFleur. Cleveland Board of Education v. LaFleur was a case in which the Supreme Court ruled that the mandatory maternity leave rules in public schools were unconstitutional under the due process clauses in the 5th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. The reasons for mandatory leave were found to be either too arbitrary, with no fixed leave and return dates chosen with a definite reason, or it had no relation to an individual teacher's medical conditions. This case was a major step in protecting the rights of female teachers from sexist prejudices and is often seen as the building block for which modern-day maternity leave laws are based on. Cohan v. California. Cohan v. California was a Supreme Court case concerning freedom of speech. It regarded a 19-year-old man named Paul Cohan, who was arrested and sentenced to 30 days in jail due to his alleged disruption of the peace. The cause of the so-called disruption was the jacket that Cohan was wearing, which contained a 4-letter expletive referencing the Vietnam War draft. By a vote of 5-4, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Cohan's sentence, emphasizing that this case concerned speech and not conduct, therefore meaning Cohan's arrest and charging was no doubt unconstitutional. It also stated California law was vague in defining what exactly offensive conduct was. The expletive that Cohan used also did not impede on anyone's right, as it was not directed to a specific person. The case has become notable in differentiating speech and conduct in order to continue to protect American citizens' First Amendment rights.
Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education was a Supreme Court case that took place in Charlotte, North Carolina, dealing with the busing of students to promote integration in public schools. The court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, busing was an appropriate remedy for the problem of racial imbalance in schools, even when the imbalance resulted from the selection of students based on geographic proximity to the school, rather than from deliberate assignment based on race. This was done to ensure the schools would be properly integrated and that all students would receive equal educational opportunities regardless of their race. Once busing was enforced, Charlotte was known across the nation as the city that made desegregation work during the 1970s and the 1980s. The ruling paved the way for many different school systems to use the busing plan to force integration in school systems.
Lemon v. Kurtzman. The trial of Lemon v. Kurtzman was a case combating a Pennsylvania law that allowed the local government to use money to fund educational programs that taught religious-based lessons. The case of Lemon v. Kurtzman was filed by Alton Lemon, a Pennsylvania instructor who claimed that the state had violated the United States Constitution's First Amendment by passing said law. Lemon's reasoning was that the Constitution does not allow the establishment of any state's laws or legislation that combine the interests of religious people with the interests of the state's population, otherwise known as the separation of church and state. The court ruled in an 8-1 decision favoring Lemon that the passing of any state laws that establish a religious body is a direct violation of the U.S. Constitution. The verdict led to the creation of the Lemon test, a classification system that is used to see whether or not state laws regarding funding or creating religious institutions with public money violate the U.S. Constitution.
Regents of the University of California versus Back was a landmark case in which it upheld affirmative action for colleges. The case began when Alan Back questioned the constitutionality of allowing students with lower academic scores into college before him, due to the fact that they were minorities. This allowed race to be one of the several factors in college admission policy, due to the historic disadvantages minority races have received in the past. However, the court also ruled that the specific racial quotas, such as UC Davis's rule that required at least 16% of admitted students to be racial minorities, were unconstitutional. Justice Lewis F. Powell presented the opinion which the Supreme Court would rule on. In it, he states that affirmative action is usually constitutional for colleges under the 14th Amendment in order to remedy past racial discrimination. However, affirmative action was not constitutional at schools that had no past discrimination against racial minorities, such as UC Davis, the college Back was applying for. It was also found unconstitutional that minority students could compete for any of the 100 seats available at a university classroom, but white students could compete for only 84. Alan Back would then be enrolled to UC Davis under this ruling. It remains a highly controversial ruling to this day. In 1996, California banned the state's use of race as a factor to consider in public schools admission policies.
Gregg v. Georgia. Gregg v. Georgia was a major decision concerning the death penalty and whether it goes against the 8th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. The case began when a Georgia man known as Troy Leon Gregg was found guilty and sentenced to death for the murder of 2 people. The case dealt with administrative law which regulates the due process clause of the U.S. Constitution. Gregg argued that the death sentence was a direct violation of the 18th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, which upheld this due process, and that it was cruel and unusual punishment. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state of Georgia in Gregg v. Georgia. The Supreme Court also stated that the execution of Troy Leon Gregg was constitutional due to the fact that Mr. Gregg was tried, had, and sentenced through the formal judicial system. This ruling essentially stated that the death penalty was not cruel and unusual punishment, and thus constitutionally allowed states to enact it.
New York Times versus United States was a major decision by the United States Supreme Court concerning the First Amendment. The ruling made it possible for the New York Times to publish the then classified Pentagon Papers without the risk of government censorship. The Pentagon Papers was a massive 2.5 million word document that featured detailed controversial government tactics in regard to the then ongoing Vietnam War. The Supreme Court case was decided 6-3 in favor of the New York Times. The justices' arguments in favor of the New York Times all lay upon the clear superiority of the right of freedom of speech that the First Amendment gave. No justice fully supported the government's case in trying to ban the publication of the papers, since the publication would not cause a breach in national security as claimed by the government. The decision was hailed as a great victory for advocates of freedom of press, and would later become used as a precedent for further cases involving freedom of speech and freedom of press. It would lead to the continuation of the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which would help move the reception of the war to largely negative. Miller v. California is now considered a landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court, in which the court redefined the word obscenity, from that of utterly without socially redeeming value, to something that lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. The court case was brought upon when in 1971 Marvin Miller, an owner of a California mail-order business specializing in pornographic films and books, sent out an advertising brochure which graphically depicted sexual intercourse. 5 of the brochures were mailed to a restaurant in Newport Beach, California. The owner and his mother opened the envelope and, seeing the brochures, called the police, which led to Marvin Miller being arrested for distributing obscene materials. Miller claimed that the arrest was a violation of his First Amendment rights, which awards him the right to speak and express him freely. The court found Miller guilty of the misdemeanor because the material he sent out was deemed unsuitable for the general population and was not meant for children to see, indicating that his speech was causing harm to others, therefore trumping his First Amendment rights. In order to better regulate future rulings on obscenity charges, the Miller test was created to indicate that materials are obscene if they lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. With a clear-cut definition of obscenity, states have gained more freedom in prosecuting for obscenity, leading to the shutdown of numerous adult theaters and bookstores in the years following.
United States v. Nixon. United States v. Nixon was a landmark Supreme Court decision, resulting in a unanimous 8-0 ruling against President Richard Nixon. The ruling is considered important to the late stages of the Watergate scandal and the resignation of Nixon, along with it being a crucial precedent in limiting the power of the United States presidents. During the Watergate scandal, prosecutor Leon Zawarski obtained a subpoena ordering Nixon to release certain tapes and papers which related to him and indicted spies of the scandal. Nixon's attorney asked the Supreme Court to reject the subpoena, stating that the president is not subject to any processes of any court except the courts of impeachment. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon must turn over the tapes, establishing that executive privilege is not absolute. The court rejected Nixon's claim to an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial processes under all circumstances. The court also ruled the evidence of the Watergate tapes was grounds for presidential indictment. Nixon resigned from office just 16 days after the ruling. Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on the issue of abortion. The context for the case began in 1969 when Norma L. McCorvey, using the alias Jane Roe in court, had discovered she was pregnant with her third child and wished to bypass Texan law, which stated that the abortion was legal only in the cases of rape and incest. The case reached the Supreme Court and was decided on in 1973. The court ruled 7-2 that women have the right to have an abortion, which is under protection of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, allowing for the right of privacy. However, it was also decided that this right must be balanced against the state's two legitimate interests in regulating abortions, which are protecting women's health and protecting the potentiality of human life. Therefore, the Supreme Court decided the state can only regulate abortions after the third trimester of pregnancy, when the fetus has developed viability. Viable was defined by the court as potentially able to live outside the mother's womb, albeit with artificial aid. In striking down many state and federal restricting abortion laws, Roe v. Wade has sparked a national debate that goes on to this day on the legality of abortion, along with what methods the Supreme Court can use for constitutional adjudication. The ruling has divided much of America into either pro-life or pro-choice camps. Unite!
The presidential term of Richard Nixon in the 1970s saw the end of the Vietnam War, the moon landings, and one of the most memorable scandals in American history, the Watergate scandal, which would leave a permanent mark on Nixon's legacy. Gerald Ford's pardoning of Nixon would virtually guarantee the victory of Jimmy Carter in the 1976 presidential election. The administration of Jimmy Carter saw the Iranian hostage crisis, which would contribute to the deterioration of U.S.-Iranian relations for years to come. In the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade expanded women's rights, but ultimately divided America into pro-life or pro-choice groups for the rest of history. It is also notable that the court upheld affirmative action programs in some cases, upheld the death penalty, and allowed the Pentagon Papers to be published, causing further deterioration of the public support for the Vietnam War. It is for these reasons and more that the 1970s were an important time in American history.